Come back, Evelyn, or prove you were nothing without me. That was the message Daniel Brooks sent, polished and casual, like everything else about him. But the words lingered in the air long after her phone screen went dark, because 5 years ago, she might have answered. She might have folded herself into the shape he expected, quiet, agreeable, grateful to be chosen. But that woman no longer existed, not in the way he remembered, not in the way he needed her to. And as Evelyn stood by the window of her apartment, the city stretched beneath her in a grid of cold lights and distant motion. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel the sharp sting of humiliation he once used so easily against her. She felt something steadier, something quieter, something far more dangerous: control, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, the kind that simply waited. Daniel had chosen the restaurant carefully. Of course he had. A private room tucked behind frosted glass and gold trim. The kind of place where deals were made over aged whiskey and soft laughter, where power dressed itself in politeness. He wanted an audience without making it obvious. A few familiar faces from the industry. A couple of mutual acquaintances who would remember exactly how this evening played out. He was setting a stage, and he believed he knew every line of the script. When Evelyn arrived, she didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the black car with a calm that didn't belong to the past version of her, her heels meeting the pavement with a quiet certainty, her coat falling open just enough to reveal a silhouette that spoke not of extravagance, but of precision. Everything about her was intentional now, measured, refined, and as she entered the restaurant, the low hum of conversation seemed to dip for half a second, just long enough to notice, just long enough to register that something had shifted. Daniel saw her before she reached the table, his smile already forming. Confident, practiced, the same smile that once convinced investors, friends, and even her, that he was always in control. Evelyn, he said, rising halfway from his seat, as if generosity itself required effort. You look different. The word hung between them, loaded with implication, but she only offered a small nod, her gaze steady, unshaken. I am, she replied, her voice even, almost soft, and for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something he dismissed just as quickly as it appeared, because in his mind, this was still his narrative, his invitation, his opportunity to remind her where she belonged. Sit, he gestured, as if granting permission, as if the last 5 years had never happened, as if she hadn't walked away from the wreckage he left behind and built something entirely her own. But Evelyn didn't sit immediately. Instead, she let her gaze move across the room, noting the faces, the subtle curiosity, the quiet expectation. They were all watching, whether they admitted it or not. They were waiting to see which version of her had shown up tonight, the woman who would shrink or the one who would remain standing. And when she finally took her seat, it wasn't submission, it was strategy. Daniel leaned back, relaxed, confident. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, a hint of amusement in his tone. I thought maybe pride would get in the way. Evelyn met his gaze, unblinking. No, she said calmly. I just wanted to see how this ends. The words were simple, almost effortless, but they landed differently, heavier, like a quiet promise rather than a response. And somewhere beneath the polished surface of the evening, something unseen had already begun to move, something Daniel hadn't accounted for. Not yet, because he still believed this was his invitation, his stage, his control, and he had no idea that by asking her to return, he had just stepped into a story that no longer belonged to him. Daniel spoke first, because he always did, filling the space with confidence that sounded effortless but was carefully constructed. He asked about her life as if it were a footnote, something small and easily summarized, something that could fit neatly into the narrative he preferred. And Evelyn let him speak. She let the silence stretch just enough after each of his sentences to make him fill it again, because that was his nature, to dominate, to assume, to perform. And across the table, the soft glow of candlelight reflected against crystal glasses and polished silver, casting fragments of light that danced across his face. But none of it reached his eyes. Those remained sharp, calculating, still trying to measure her, still trying to place her back into a category he understood. So what are you doing now, Evelyn? He finally asked, leaning forward slightly, the question casual. but the intent precise. He wanted to hear. Something small, something safe, something that would confirm his belief that she had not moved beyond him, that she had not outgrown the life he once controlled. And for a moment, she said nothing, her fingers resting lightly against the stem of her glass, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. And then she answered. "I work," she said simply, her tone calm, almost indifferent. And the simplicity of it unsettled him more than any elaborate explanation could have, because it gave him nothing to dismantle, nothing to belittle, nothing to correct, just work, he repeated with a faint smile, as if amused, as if the word itself proved something. And around them, the quiet attention of the room sharpened, people pretending not to listen, but listening anyway, watching the subtle exchange like a slow unfolding performance. "You always had a talent for keeping things modest," he added, his voice smooth, but edged with something that used to cut deeper, and Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. "Modesty is a choice," she said, "and control is another." The words were not loud, they were not dramatic, but they settled into the space between them with a weight that shifted the balance ever so slightly. Daniel leaned back again, studying her now, really studying her, because something was different, not just in the way she spoke, but in the way she did not react. She did not flinch, she did not defend, she did not try to prove anything, and that absence of reaction created a tension he could not immediately resolve. "You know," he said after a pause, swirling his drink again, "I thought about reaching out sooner, but I figured you needed time." He let the implication linger, as if her distance had been a phase, as if her silence had been weakness, and Evelyn almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable. Time did not change anything. "Daniel," she said quietly, "it just reveals what was already there." And for a brief second, the noise of the room seemed to fade, replaced by something sharper, something quieter, the kind of silence that comes before a realization. But Daniel dismissed it. He always did when something did not fit his expectations. "So, why now?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly, curiosity slipping through the confidence. "Why come back tonight?" And this time, Evelyn did smile, just barely, a controlled curve of her lips that held no warmth, no nostalgia, only certainty. "You invited me," she said, and then after a beat, "I accepted." The simplicity of it felt deliberate, like a piece of a larger design he could not yet see. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of the private room, past the soft lighting and curated elegance, something else was already in motion, unseen, carefully aligned. And as Daniel lifted his glass again, confident that this evening was still his to control, he did not notice the subtle shift in the room, the quiet glances exchanged between two men near the entrance, the brief nod from a woman speaking softly into her phone, small details, easily overlooked, unless you knew what to look for, unless you had planned them. And Evelyn sat there, composed, patient, already several steps ahead, waiting for the moment when the room would stop listening to him and start listening to her. The shift happened so quietly that most people did not notice it at first, just a subtle change in posture, in attention, in the way conversations began to slow and drift towards something unseen. And Daniel was still speaking, still explaining a new expansion, a new deal, his voice smooth and confident. When the door to the private room opened without urgency, but with purpose, a man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped inside, followed by two others, their presence understated but unmistakable, and the energy in the room adjusted in a way that could not be ignored. Daniel paused mid-sentence, his brows tightening just slightly, irritation flickering before composure returned. He was not used to interruptions. "Not here. Not like this." The man offered a polite nod, his voice calm, measured, apologizing for the timing, but requesting a moment, just a moment, and the phrasing itself carried weight, because it was not a question, it was a courtesy. Daniel forced a smile, glancing briefly at Evelyn as if to reassure himself that he still understood the room. "Of course," he said, though the word felt thinner than before. The man stepped further in, placing a slim folder on the table with deliberate care, and for a second, no one moved. The soft clink of glass somewhere in the background sounded louder than it should have. "Mr. Brooks," he continued, "we have finalized the transfer agreement." And the words did not register immediately, not fully, because Daniel was still expecting context, still expecting control. Transfer of what? He asked, a faint edge creeping into his tone, and that was when the man turned slightly, not toward him, but toward Evelyn, just enough to shift the entire axis of the moment. Miss Carter, he said with quiet respect, everything is in place, and the room did not erupt. It did not gasp. It simply fell into a deeper kind of silence, the kind that absorbs realization one breath at a time. Daniel looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time without the filter of who she used to be. What is he talking about? He asked, the question no longer smooth, no longer controlled. And Evelyn rose slowly from her seat, not in a rush, not in triumph, but with the same measured precision she had carried all evening, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair before she stepped forward, the movement drawing every eye in the room without effort. She did not look at Daniel immediately. Instead, she opened the folder, her gaze scanning the pages as if confirming something she already knew, something that had been decided long before. This night, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and impossible to interrupt. The board approved the acquisition this afternoon, she said, her words steady, each one landing with quiet authority. Daniel stared at her, disbelief tightening into something sharper. That is not possible, he said. But even as he spoke, the certainty was already slipping, because the room was no longer aligned with him. The attention had shifted completely. Investors, partners, even the people who had laughed with him minutes ago were now watching her, waiting, and Evelyn closed the folder gently, her fingers resting against it for just a second before she met his gaze. It is already done, she said. And there was no need to explain further, no need to justify, because the truth was not in the words, it was in the silence that followed, in the way no one questioned her, in the way no one turned back to him. And Daniel felt it then, not humiliation, not yet, but the absence of control, the sudden, undeniable realization that the structure he believed he owned had shifted beneath him without a sound. You invited me back, Evelyn continued softly, not as an accusation, not as a victory, just a statement of fact. And then after a brief pause, her gaze steady, her presence unshakable, you just did not realize what you were handing over. And she stepped past him, not waiting for a response, not needing one. As the room instinctively parted, conversations recalibrating, attention following her without instruction, because in that moment, there was no announcement, no declaration, only a quiet understanding shared by everyone present. The power had changed hands, and it had happened long before he ever sent the invitation. No one spoke to Daniel as Evelyn crossed the room, not because they were afraid of him, but because they were no longer looking at him. The gravity had shifted completely, and it was a strange, quiet thing, how power did not need to raise its voice to be felt. It simply redirected attention, and now every conversation bent subtly toward her. Investors straightened, voices softened. Even the waitstaff adjusted their movements as if instinctively recognizing a new center of control, and Evelyn did not rush. She did not acknowledge the stares directly, but she felt them, the weight of recognition, the recalibration happening in real time, and for a brief moment, the room blurred at the edges, not from emotion, but from memory, because she had stood in rooms like this before, years ago, when her name had meant something else, when she had been introduced as an extension of Daniel, a quiet presence beside him, supportive, agreeable, easily overlooked. She remembered the way people used to look through her, past her, as if she were part of the decor, elegant but irrelevant. And now those same types of eyes followed her with something entirely different, respect, curiosity, calculation, and she did not take it personally, not anymore, because she understood now that it was never about who she was. It was about what she represented, and tonight, she represented control. One of the men near the entrance approached her carefully, his expression composed but attentive. "Miss Carter, congratulations," he said, extending his hand. "We have been looking forward to this transition." And she shook his hand with a firm, measured grip, not lingering, not dismissive, simply acknowledging. "Thank you," she replied, her tone even, professional, and he nodded, stepping slightly to the side, as if making space for her to continue forward, because that was what the room did now. It made space. Behind her, Daniel remained where she had left him, standing beside the table that no longer felt like his glass untouched, his posture no longer relaxed. He watched as conversations formed around her without invitation, as people adjusted their positions, their priorities, their loyalties, and it was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was precise, like a structure being reassembled piece by piece without a single visible command. And that was the part he could not grasp. There had been no warning, no confrontation, no battle to prepare for, just a quiet shift that had already completed itself before he realized it had begun. He took a step forward as if to speak, to reclaim something, anything. But the moment did not wait for him. It moved past him, indifferent, and across the room. Evelyn paused near the tall windows that overlooked the city, the glass reflecting both her present and the faint outline of who she used to be. And for a second, she allowed herself to breathe, not in relief, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. This was not revenge, it was resolution, the culmination of choices made in silence, of nights spent rebuilding something no one else could see, of learning that power was not given. It was taken quietly, methodically, without announcement. Footsteps approached behind her, measured, hesitant, and she knew without turning who it was. Daniel stopped a few feet away, the distance between them no longer symbolic, but real. "You planned this," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier confidence, and Evelyn turned to face him, her expression calm, unreadable. "I prepared," she corrected gently, because planning implied a reaction, and this had never been about reacting to him. It had been about moving beyond him entirely. He searched her face, as if trying to find something familiar, something he could still understand. But there was nothing there that belonged to his version of her, and that absence unsettled him more than anything she could have said. "You could have told me," he added, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. And for the first time, Evelyn's gaze softened, not with sympathy, but with clarity. "You never listened," she said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, just truth, simple and unembellished. And before he could respond, before he could find a way to reframe the moment, she stepped past him once more, not dismissing him, not acknowledging him further, simply continuing forward, because the story he thought he was part of had already ended, and the one she had built did not require his understanding. Only his absence. The night did not end with applause, it ended with adjustment, the kind that happens quietly when power shifts and everyone pretends it was always meant to be this way. And Evelyn moved through the room without urgency, her presence no longer questioned, only acknowledged. Conversations parted and reformed around her like currents adapting to a new center, and each step she took felt deliberate, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she no longer needed to rush toward anything either. She had already arrived. One of the senior partners approached her near the bar, his posture respectful, his tone measured. "We should schedule a board meeting first thing Monday morning," he said, already aligning himself with the future rather than the past. And Evelyn nodded once, concise, decisive. "Monday at 9, she replied, her voice calm, as if this had always been the plan, because for her, it had. Across the room, Daniel finally sat down. The chair that once symbolized authority, now just a place to rest, his gaze unfocused for a moment as the noise returned around him. But it sounded different now, distant, disconnected, like he was hearing it from the wrong side of a conversation. People no longer sought his reaction. They no longer waited for his approval, and the absence of that attention was louder than any confrontation could have been. He looked toward Evelyn again, watching as she spoke with investors who had once deferred to him, watching the subtle shift in their expressions, the way they listened, the way they responded, and he realized something he had never considered before. Influence was not claimed, it was granted, and once it moved, it rarely returned. Evelyn paused briefly as a server offered her a glass of sparkling water. She accepted it with a quiet thank you, her fingers steady, her posture relaxed, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small exhale, not of relief, but of closure, because this room, this moment, this version of her life no longer held any weight over her. It was no longer something to conquer or reclaim. It was simply something she had outgrown. A younger associate approached her then, nervous but eager. "Ms. Carter, I just wanted to say it is an honor," he said, his words careful, genuine, and Evelyn offered a small nod. meeting his eyes briefly. "Make sure your work reflects that," she said, not unkindly, but with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. He nodded quickly, absorbing the message, and stepped aside. And as she turned slightly, her gaze caught the reflection in the window once more, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, lights layered upon lights, movement within movement, and she saw herself there, not as she had been, but as she was now, composed, defined, unshaken. Behind her, Daniel finally stood again. As if the act itself might restore something, he took a step forward, then another, but stopped short before reaching her. The distance between them now more than physical. It was final, and he understood that in a way that did not require words. Evelyn did not turn back this time. She did not need to, because whatever needed to be said had already been spoken in silence, in action, in the simple fact that she no longer belonged to his version of the world. And as the evening continued around them, adapting, evolving, moving forward without pause, Evelyn set her glass down, straightened slightly, and began to walk toward the exit, not to leave, but to transition, because this was not an ending. It was a continuation on her terms, and behind her, the room carried on. But it carried on differently now, aligned to a new center, one that did not demand attention, but naturally held it. And for the first time, Daniel was no longer part of that center. He was just another presence in the background, watching as everything he once controlled moved forward without him, while she stepped into what had always been waiting, not for his permission, but for her arrival. The doors closed softly behind her, sealing the room and everything it represented on the other side. And for a moment, the hallway felt almost too quiet. The hum of the city filtered through glass. And distance, a low, steady reminder that the world did not pause for anyone, not even moments like this. Evelyn walked without hesitation, her heels echoing faintly against the polished floor, each step grounded, unhurried, as if she had already moved past the need to look back. And in truth, she had. The elevator arrived without delay, its doors opening with a smooth, silent precision, and she stepped inside alone, the mirrored walls reflecting her from every angle, not as a fragmented image, but as a complete one. And as the doors slid shut, she allowed herself a single breath, deeper this time, not because she was overwhelmed, but because there was nothing left to hold in, no tension to manage, no version of herself to maintain for anyone else. The woman staring back at her was not performing. She simply was. The elevator began its descent, floor by floor, each number lighting up in a quiet sequence, and with it came memories, not in a rush, not in chaos, but in controlled flashes. The nights she had sat alone in a small apartment, reviewing documents she barely understood at the time, teaching herself the language of contracts, of leverage, of ownership. The early mornings spent building connections that no one saw as significant, the conversations where she listened more than she spoke, absorbing patterns, identifying gaps, learning where influence actually lived beneath the surface. She remembered the first share she acquired, small, almost insignificant, and how she had held on to it not as an asset, but as a foothold, something steady in a space that once excluded her. And then the second, and the third, quiet acquisitions layered over time, unnoticed because no one thought to look, because no one believed she would know where to begin. And that had been their first mistake. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft chime, and the doors opened to the lobby, wide and understated, the kind of space designed to impress without announcing itself. She stepped forward, her reflection disappearing behind her as the real world came back into focus. The doorman nodded respectfully, not out of recognition of who she had been, but because of who she clearly was now. And outside, the night air carried a crisp edge, cool against her skin, grounding, real. The city stretched before her in layers of light and movement, cars passing, conversations drifting, life continuing without pause. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was catching up to it. She felt aligned with it. Her phone vibrated once in her hand, a message, concise, expected. The final confirmation that everything had been processed, everything secured. She glanced at it briefly, then locked the screen without response. There was nothing left to confirm, not tonight. Behind her, high above, the room she had just left continued without her, but it no longer defined anything about her direction, her pace, her choices, and somewhere up there, Daniel was still standing in the aftermath of something he had never seen coming, trying to understand a shift that had already completed itself. But Evelyn did not think about him now, not because she was avoiding it, but because he was no longer relevant to where she was going. A black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepping out to open the door. "Miss Carter," he said politely, and she gave a small nod, stepping inside with the same calm certainty she had carried all evening. As the door closed and the car began to move, the city lights sliding past the window in a steady rhythm, she rested back slightly, her gaze forward, not on what she had left behind, but on what was already unfolding ahead, because this had never been about returning, it had always been about arriving, and now that she had, there was only one thing left to do: move forward, without looking back, without slowing down, without asking for anything she had already claimed for herself. The city moved around her in a steady rhythm, headlights stretching into thin lines of white and red as the car carried her through streets that no longer felt distant or unreachable. And Evelyn watched it all with a quiet awareness, not detached, but no longer consumed by it. The glass reflecting her face in fragments between passing lights, each reflection layered with something she had built piece by piece. And for a moment, she let her gaze soften, not in weakness, but in recognition of how far she had come without anyone noticing. Because that had been the point. Silence had always been her advantage. The car turned onto a quieter avenue, the noise of the city dimming slightly, replaced by a more controlled stillness, and her phone vibrated again. This time a call. She glanced at the name before answering, her tone steady. Yes, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, confirming what had already been set in motion. The legal filings were complete, the board had acknowledged the transition, and the first internal announcements would be sent out before morning. Evelyn listened without interruption, absorbing the information with the same measured focus she had carried all evening. "Good," she said simply, no excitement, no relief, just confirmation, because this was not a surprise to her. It was the result of decisions made long before tonight. When the call ended, she set the phone aside, her fingers resting lightly against her lap as she looked forward again. And for the first time since leaving the building, a different kind of thought surfaced. Not about the company, not about the room she had just left, but about the version of herself that had once believed she needed permission to exist in spaces like that. She remembered standing beside Daniel at events just like tonight, smiling when expected, speaking when prompted, shrinking when necessary. And she realized now that she had not just been overlooked, she had allowed herself to be, because she had been taught that presence required approval, that worth needed validation, and it had taken losing everything for her to understand that. None of it had ever been true. The car slowed as it approached her building, a modern structure of glass and steel that reflected the night sky like a mirror. The driver pulled up smoothly, stepping out to open the door, and Evelyn stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool air brushing against her face again, sharper now, more grounding. She paused for a second, her gaze lifting toward the upper floors where lights still burned in scattered windows, lives continuing behind each one, independent, self-contained, and she felt a quiet alignment with that, no longer tied to someone else's narrative, no longer shaped by someone else's expectations, just moving forward on her own terms. Inside, the lobby was quiet, understated, the kind of space that did not demand attention but held it effortlessly. The receptionist offered a polite nod as she passed. "Miss Carter, welcome back," and the words carried a subtle weight. Not because of recognition, but because of acknowledgement. She stepped into the elevator once more, this time the ascent slow and steady, each floor bringing her closer to a space that was entirely hers, not borrowed, not shared, not defined by anyone else. And when the doors opened, she stepped into her apartment, the lights responding automatically, casting a soft glow across clean lines and intentional design. Everything in its place, everything chosen, nothing excessive, nothing lacking. She set her keys down quietly, her heels following, the silence of the space settling around her in a way that felt earned rather than empty. And as she moved toward the window, the city stretching out beneath her once again, she rested her hand lightly against the glass, not searching, not questioning, just observing, because for the first time, There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim. Only what came next, and somewhere across the city, in a room that no longer mattered to her. Daniel was still trying to understand what had happened, trying to trace the moment where control had slipped from his grasp. But Evelyn knew the truth. It had never been a single moment. It had been a series of quiet decisions, made in silence, carried forward without announcement. And tonight had simply been the point where the world finally caught up to what she had already become. Morning arrived without ceremony. A soft gray light slipping through the floor-to-ceiling windows and settling across the quiet stillness of Evelyn's apartment. And for a moment, the world felt paused, suspended between what had been and what was about to unfold. But she did not linger in that stillness. She moved through it, deliberate, composed, her reflection passing across glass and polished surfaces as she prepared for a day that had already been set in motion long before the sun rose. The city below was waking in layers, traffic building, voices returning, momentum gathering, and somewhere within that rhythm, her name was already being spoken in rooms she had not yet entered, emails sent, messages forwarded, decisions quietly adjusting in response to what had been finalized the night before. She stepped into her office just after 9, the space expansive but precise. Designed not for display, but for clarity, a long table of dark wood, clean lines, no unnecessary detail. Everything serving a purpose. The air carried a faint scent of leather and fresh paper, and as she crossed the room, the subtle shift in attention was immediate. Conversations paused, eyes lifted, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. The room had already aligned itself to her presence before she said a word. "Miss Carter, good morning." One of the board members greeted, his tone respectful, measured, and she acknowledged him with a small nod as she took her seat at the head of the table, not as a gesture of authority, but because that was where she belonged now. The meeting began without introduction, without delay. Reports were presented, numbers reviewed, projections outlined, and through it all, Evelyn listened more than she spoke, her gaze steady, her focus precise, absorbing not just the information, but the dynamics beneath it, who hesitated, who adapted, who had already shifted their loyalties, and who still held on to the past out of habit rather than reason. And when she did speak, it was not to dominate the room, but to refine it. Concise questions, clear direction, adjustments that required no repetition, because her words did not need emphasis to carry weight. They were understood the first time. Across the table, one of the executives hesitated before presenting his proposal, his confidence faltering just enough to reveal uncertainty. And Evelyn watched him for a moment, not critically, but with intention. "Walk me through your assumptions again," she said calmly, and her tone did not challenge him. It steadied him, guiding rather than undermining, and as he spoke, finding his footing, the room adjusted again, not to him, but to her, because it was her clarity that defined the space now, not his hesitation. Hours passed without friction, without raised voices, without the need for control to be asserted, because it was already understood. And when the meeting concluded, there was no lingering, no unnecessary conversation. People gathered their materials, exchanged brief acknowledgments, and moved forward with the direction that had been set. Efficient, aligned, outside the glass walls of the conference room, the office moved with a new rhythm, subtle but undeniable, conversations sharper, decisions quicker, as if the entire structure had recalibrated itself overnight. Evelyn remained seated for a moment after the room cleared, her hands resting lightly against the table, the quiet settling in around her again, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to observe the space not as something she had taken, but as something she had shaped. And the difference mattered, because taking implied force, and she had used none, only precision, only patience, only time. Her phone vibrated once beside her, a message from a number she recognized but did not expect. She glanced at it, her expression unchanged, and without responding, she set the phone face down on the table, because whatever it contained no longer held urgency. Not for her. She stood then, smoothing the line of her jacket with a simple, unconscious motion, and stepped out into the flow of the office, the path ahead already clear, already hers, not because anyone had given it to her, but because she had built it in silence, long before anyone thought to look for it. The message stayed on her phone longer than it should have, not because it demanded attention, but because of who it came from. And Evelyn noticed that more than anything else, not the words, not the timing, just the fact that after everything, Daniel had chosen to reach out. And she let the screen remain dark as she moved through the office, her pace unchanged, her focus uninterrupted, because whatever he had to say now existed outside the structure of her decisions, outside the system she had built, and that alone stripped it of urgency. The day unfolded with a precision that felt almost inevitable. Meetings aligned, reports refined, strategies adjusted in real time, as if the company itself had been waiting for this level of clarity. And Evelyn moved through it all without friction, her presence no longer questioned, only integrated. By mid-afternoon, the city beyond the windows had shifted into a sharper light, reflections clearer, edges more defined, and inside, the office carried that same tone, focused, intentional, moving forward without hesitation. It was only when she returned to her office that the message resurfaced, not on the screen, but in her mind, a quiet reminder that the past had not entirely disappeared. It had simply lost its influence. She set her tablet down on the desk, her fingers resting lightly against the surface as she considered, not whether to respond, but whether it mattered. And that distinction was important, because there had been a time when every word from him carried weight, when his attention defined her direction, when silence from him felt like absence. And now, it was just a message, nothing more. She picked up the phone, unlocking it without hesitation this time. The text was short, stripped of its usual confidence. "We need to talk." And for a brief moment, the simplicity of it almost felt familiar, but she recognized it for what it was, not authority, not control, just an attempt to re-enter a space he no longer occupied. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a second, not uncertain, just deliberate, and then she typed. One line, no elaboration, no invitation, send it through legal. She read it once, not to reconsider, but to confirm its clarity. And then she pressed send, the message disappearing instantly, absorbed into a system that no longer revolved around him. Outside her office, the movement of the company continued without pause, decisions cascading through departments, adjustments being implemented with a speed that reflected trust, not pressure. And Evelyn stepped back into that flow as if she had never left it, because in truth, she had not. She had simply stepped aside for a moment to acknowledge something that no longer held power over her. Hours later, as the light outside softened into evening, the city shifting once again into its layered glow, she stood by the window, her reflection merging with the skyline beyond, and she thought briefly, not about Daniel, not about what he might say or what he might want, but about how easily she could have answered differently, how easily she could have stepped back into a conversation that once defined her. And she understood then that growth was not just about moving forward. It was about recognizing when something no longer deserved a response. Her phone remained silent after that. No follow-up, no insistence, just stillness, and that told her everything she needed to know, because for the first time, he was the one waiting. And she was the one who had already moved on, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something far more final, indifference. And as the city lights sharpened against the darkening sky, Evelyn turned away from the glass, her focus returning to what was in front of her, not because she had to, but because that was where her life existed now, not in what had been left behind, but in what she continued to build, quietly, steadily, without ever needing to look back. The reply did not come that evening, and it did not come the next morning either. But that silence was not empty. It carried a different weight now, one that Evelyn recognized immediately, because she had lived inside that kind of silence before, the kind that followed when control slipped and there was nothing left to negotiate with. And she did not check her phone for it. She did not anticipate it, because whatever response Daniel could offer now would arrive too late to change anything that had already been set in motion. The days moved forward with a steady precision, each one building on the last, decisions flowing through the company with clarity and intent, and Evelyn remained at the center of it without needing to assert it, her presence alone enough to define direction. By the third day, the shift was no longer subtle, it was structural. Departments that once operated in isolation began aligning, inefficiencies were addressed without resistance, and the tone of communication changed from cautious to direct. as if the entire organization had been waiting for permission to function at its full capacity, and now it had it. Mid-morning, her assistant entered with a folder and a brief pause. "He is here," she said, her voice professional but edged with something softer, not uncertainty, but awareness, and Evelyn did not look up immediately. Her attention still on the document in front of her, she finished reading the last line, closed the folder, and only then lifted her gaze. "Where?" she asked calmly. "Reception," the assistant replied. "He asked to see you." And for a moment, the room held still, not because of tension, but because of timing. This was the moment where the past attempted to step into the present without invitation, and Evelyn understood that clearly. "Send him to conference room B," she said, her tone unchanged, and the assistant nodded, stepping away without question. Minutes later, the door to the conference room opened, and Daniel stepped inside, the space bright with natural light, glass walls framing the city beyond, everything visible, nothing hidden, and he paused just inside the threshold, as if adjusting to an environment that no longer belonged to him. His posture still composed, but lacking the ease it once carried. He looked around briefly, taking in the details, the absence of anything familiar, and then the door opened again, and Evelyn entered, not quickly, not slowly, just with the same measured pace she had carried through every moment since that night. She did not offer her hand. She did not offer a greeting. She simply took her seat at the far side of the table, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, and for a second, Daniel remained standing, as if unsure whether to approach or wait, and that hesitation, subtle as it was, said more than anything he could have spoken. "You wanted to talk," she said, her voice even, giving him exactly what he had asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. He sat down then, the movement controlled but deliberate, his eyes fixed on her as if searching for something he had lost the ability to name. "I did not expect you to respond like that," he said, the words careful, stripped of their usual edge, and Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not in curiosity, but in acknowledgement. "How did you expect me to respond?" she asked, and the question was not defensive. It was precise, forcing him to confront the assumption he had carried into the room. He exhaled quietly, his gaze dropping for a brief second before returning to her. "I thought we could handle this directly," he said, and there it was, the echo of the past, the belief that proximity still meant access, that history still meant influence, and Evelyn let the silence settle between them for a moment before answering. "This is direct," she said, her tone unchanged, because for her, it was. There was no emotion clouding the exchange, no unresolved tension shaping her words, just clarity, and Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her again, trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the one he remembered. But there was no overlap left to find. "You built all of this without anyone knowing," he said finally, and it was not admiration, not quite disbelief, just recognition. And Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. "I did not need anyone to know," she replied, because the outcome had never depended on their awareness, only on her execution. And as the silence returned once more, heavier now, more defined, it became clear that this conversation was not about resolution. It was about realization, and Daniel was only just beginning to understand how far behind he had fallen. Daniel did not speak immediately, and for the first time since she had known him, the silence around him was not strategic. It was unfamiliar, like he had stepped into a space where his usual instincts no longer applied. And Evelyn watched him with a calm that did not press, did not provoke, simply observed. Because this was not a moment she needed to control, it was one he needed to understand. "You could have told me," he said finally, the words quieter now, stripped of the certainty that once defined him, and the statement lingered in the air, not as an accusation, but as something closer to confusion, as if he was trying to trace a version of events where this outcome made sense to him. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, unhurried. "I did tell you," she said, her voice even, and he frowned slightly, searching his memory. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "You did not." And she held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "I told you every time you dismissed me," she said, not sharply, not emotionally, just fact. "Every time you decided I was not worth listening to, that was me telling you exactly who I was becoming." And the words did not land like an argument. They settled like something that had always been true, something he had simply chosen not to see. Daniel leaned back slowly, his expression shifting, not defensive, not yet, but unsettled in a way that was harder to mask. That is not the same thing, he said, though the conviction in his voice had thinned, and Evelyn tilted her head slightly. The smallest acknowledgement of the gap between his perception and reality. It is, she replied, because you only recognize information when it benefits you, and I stopped offering it when it did not. The room held that statement without interruption, the quiet pressing in around them. And outside the glass walls, the movement of the office continued, unaffected. Because this conversation, as significant as it felt in the moment, was no longer central to anything that mattered, Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly to the city beyond before returning to her. So this is it then, he said, the words carrying something softer now, something closer to resignation than resistance. You take everything and just move on. And for the first time, there was no accusation in the statement, only an attempt to understand the shape of what had happened. Evelyn considered him for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, simply seeing him as he was now, separate from the past, separate from the influence he once held. I did not take everything, she said calmly. I took responsibility, and the distinction was subtle, but it changed the entire meaning, because taking implied removal, and responsibility implied ownership, accountability, intent. And Daniel seemed to recognize that, even if he could not fully articulate it, his expression tightening slightly as the realization settled in. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, just clear, defined, and then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if acknowledging something he could not argue against. You always were. He began, but the sentence did not finish, the words dissolving before they could form into something complete, and Evelyn did not prompt him, did not fill the gap, because whatever he had been about to say no longer held. Wait, not here, not now. She stood then, the motion smooth, unforced, signaling not the end of a conversation, but the completion of it. This meeting was never about negotiation, never about closure. It was simply the point where he saw clearly what had already happened, and as she stepped away from the table, her presence remained composed, unchanged. She paused briefly, just long enough to meet his gaze one last time, not with finality, not with triumph, but with something quieter, understanding. You should focus on what comes next, she said, her voice steady, because that was the only direction left for him. Forward, even if it looked nothing like what he had planned. And then she turned, walking toward the door without hesitation, leaving him in a space that was no longer his, not in ownership, not in influence, only in memory. And as the door closed behind her, the room settled into stillness once more, but this time, it belonged entirely to him, along with the realization that what he had lost was not taken in a single moment. It had been given away slowly, piece by piece. Every time he chose not to see her clearly, the door closed behind her with a quiet certainty that did not echo, did not linger. It simply marked the end of something that had already concluded long before this moment. And Evelyn did not slow her pace as she stepped back into the flow of the office, because there was nothing behind her that required a second glance. The hallway stretched ahead in clean lines and muted tones, people moving with purpose, conversations continuing without interruption, and as she passed, there was a subtle shift, not dramatic, not forced, just a natural recalibration of attention, a recognition that did not need to be spoken. Her assistant approached with a tablet in hand. Already mid-update, the European partners confirmed the call for this afternoon, she said, her voice efficient, aligned, and Evelyn nodded once, her focus already moving forward. Reschedule it to earlier, she replied. I want the numbers finalized before the market closes. And the adjustment was immediate, no hesitation, no need for clarification, because the structure around her no longer questioned direction, it followed it. She stepped into her office, the space unchanged yet different in the way it now responded to her presence, the light sharper, the silence more intentional, and for a brief moment, she stood still, not reflecting, not revisiting, simply acknowledging the stillness before the next movement. Her phone remained untouched on the desk, no new messages, no missed calls, just quiet. And that quiet carried a clarity she recognized, because it meant there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to revisit, only what came next. She moved to her desk, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface as she opened the next file. Numbers, projections, decisions waiting to be made. And as she read, her focus sharpened instantly, the past dissolving not through effort, but through irrelevance, because it no longer intersected with what she was building. Hours passed with the same steady rhythm, calls made, strategies refined, and by late afternoon, the skyline beyond her window shifted into a warmer tone, the sun lowering just enough to cast long reflections across the glass. And she paused for a second, her gaze lifting, not to escape, but to observe. The city continued, endless, layered, moving forward without waiting for anyone, and she felt aligned with that now, no longer catching up, no longer adjusting, just moving within it on her own terms. Behind her, the door opened softly, her assistant stepping in with a final update. "Everything is set for tomorrow," she said, and Evelyn nodded, closing the file in front of her. "Good," she replied, her voice calm, decisive. And as the assistant left, the room settled once more, quiet, composed, hers. She stood then, moving toward the window, the reflection meeting her again, not fragmented, not uncertain, but whole. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to see it clearly, not as a comparison to who she had been, but as confirmation of who she had become. There was no triumph in it, no need to measure the distance traveled, just a quiet understanding that she had arrived somewhere she once could not even define. And behind that understanding was something even steadier. She had done it, without noise, without spectacle, without ever needing to prove it to anyone. And that was what made it real. Her phone remained silent on the desk behind her, and she did not turn back to it, because whatever remained there belonged to a version of her life that no longer existed. And as the last light of the day settled across the city, softening edges, blending lines, Evelyn turned away from the window, her focus returning to what lay ahead, because there was still work to be done, still decisions to make, still a future unfolding that did not depend on anything she had left behind. And she moved toward it with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every step so far, not looking back, not needing to, because everything that mattered was already in front of her. The next morning did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with clarity, the kind that settled quietly into place when there was nothing left unresolved, and Evelyn stepped into her office with the same steady pace, the same composed presence. But something had shifted, not in the environment, not in the people around her, but in the absence of anything pulling her backward. The weight of the past had not followed her here. It had simply fallen away somewhere along the path she had already walked, and as she moved through the office, the rhythm of the space aligned with her without effort, conversations precise, decisions immediate, everything moving forward without friction, because there was no longer any resistance left to push against. She entered the conference room where the executive team was already gathered, their attention turning toward her not out of obligation, but out of certainty. And she took her place at the head of the table, not as a symbol, but as a function. This was where she worked, where she decided, where she built. The meeting began, voices steady, reports delivered, projections refined, and through it all, Evelyn listened, her focus sharp, her presence quiet but absolute. And when she spoke, it was not to assert control, but to direct it, her words measured, final, leaving no space for ambiguity, because she no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. The room had already accepted the direction she set. Halfway through the meeting, her phone vibrated once on the table beside her. A brief interruption, subtle, but noticeable, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they were waiting, but because the silence itself had weight. Evelyn glanced at the screen, the name familiar, expected, Daniel, and for a fraction of a second, the moment held still, not with tension, but with recognition. This was the last thread, the final echo of something that no longer existed. She looked at it, not with hesitation, not with emotion, just awareness. And then, without breaking her composure, without shifting her posture, she turned the phone face down and continued speaking, as if nothing had happened, as if nothing needed to happen. And the meeting resumed instantly. No pause, no disruption, because the message had already been answered by her silence, by her focus, by the simple fact that it no longer mattered. The rest of the day unfolded with the same quiet precision, decisions made, strategies set, the company moving forward under her direction without resistance, without doubt, and by the time the evening settled across the city once more, the skyline glowing in layers of light and reflection, Evelyn stood by the window again, her hand resting lightly against the glass, not searching, not remembering, just present, fully, completely, and behind her, the office remained active, voices low, purposeful, aligned, and she understood then, not as a realization, but as a confirmation, that everything she had once been told she needed to beg for, to prove, to earn, had never required permission at all. It had only required her to claim it, quietly, completely, without asking. And as the reflection of the city merged with her own, she did not see the woman who had been left behind. She saw the one who had moved forward without waiting, without turning back, and somewhere, far removed from this moment, Daniel was still reaching towards something that no longer existed, still trying to understand a version of her that had already disappeared. But Evelyn no longer thought about that, because there was nothing left there for